Babbage and his Engines, Part 3. Charles Babbage was born in London, December 1791. Educated mainly at home. He was in poor health as a child, but his father was a banker, so they were quite well off and they could afford the tutors. From an early age, he showed a great interest in inventing things. These paddles for walking on water actually did work. Well, long enough to get out from shore, at which point the glue dissolved in the water and he had problems getting back to shore. He went to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1811, transferred to Peterhouse a year later, and received an honorary degree from Peterhouse in 14. He married Georgina Whitmore. They had 8 children, but only 3 survived. She has been described as a dutiful wife. In 21, he started building the difference engine. His designs had been completed at that point. And in 27, he had a dreadful year. His father, wife, 1 son, and a newborn all died. Different circumstances, but in the same year. In 1827, he left his business to his friend, John Herschel, and set off to travel around Europe with one of his workmen. In 1828, he found, by chance, an English newspaper and found he'd been appointed to the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge. He had applied years earlier, but had completely forgotten about it. So he came back to England and recovered his business from John, and he and his engineer, Joseph Clement, set out to build a portion of the difference engine, what we would call a prototype. And in 1832, later that year, the British government funding for his difference engine ran out. It was a year later, in 1833, that he met Lady Lovelace, then aged 17. In 1830, he published Reflections on Decline of Science in England and on some of its causes. He was clearly a rather angry young man because he wrote, "Propose to an Englishman any principle or any instrument, however admirable, and you will observe that the whole effort of the English mind is directed to finding a difficulty, a defect, or an impossibility in it. If you speak to him of a machine for peeling a potato, he will pronounce it impossible. If you peel a potato with it before his eyes, he will declare it useless because it will not slice a pineapple." He was critical of the Royal Society. In 1662, fellows in 1830, only 140, starting a little bit again. He was critical of the Royal Society. They recommended that the election of fellows take place on one day every year, that the fellows be selected on consideration of their scientific achievements, and that the number of fellows elected in a year to be limited to 15. The Literary Gazette in 1832 wrote of Charles Babbage as the logarithmatical Frankenstein. He inherited his father's estate, including his house on Dorset Street, and an estate estimated at about £100,000. And it was at this house he held his renowned dinner parties. You could only be invited by very intelligent or very influential. And since a woman at that time could be neither of those things, a woman just had to be very beautiful. Now imagine going to dinner and sitting across the table from, well, let's start with the 4 Charleses: Charles Babbage, Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin, and Charles Wheatstone. Wheatstone had co-developed the electric telegraph and had worked on ways of measuring electrical resistance. You might also find at the table Faraday, of electrical fame, Stephenson, of the Stephenson rocket, and Brunel, who built the Great Western Railway and many wonderful bridges and other features. Conversation would be lively, and there would have been parallels to today. We had abolitionists railing against companies and government over slavery, whereas today we have climate activists railing against companies and government over climate change. Doran Swade wrote, "Not everyone was preoccupied with the advancement of mind. The geologist Charles Lyell pressed Babbage to invite Colonel Codrington's wife, whom Lyell had heard was very pretty. Lyell also urged Charles Darwin, returned from his 5-year adventure on the Beagle in 1836, to attend Babbage's, where he would meet the fashionable intelligentsia and, more to the point, beautiful women. One Roranzov Grieg asked for an engine demonstration to impress two lady friends, a Miss Parker and a Miss Sandbath from Liverpool. Very young and very pretty. Babbage became a sought-after dinner guest. He was a celebrity, an engaging raconteur, full of wit and exuberant invention. To be able to say, "Mr. Babbage is coming to dinner," was the pleasure and delight of any hostess. If you were invited, in one of the entrance rooms of his house, you would have seen this portrait. It's of Jacquard loom fame, who had died a little earlier. It's quite small, 22 inches by 14 inches. And viewers would look at it and think it was a lithograph. And Babbage would explain, if you go up and look very closely, you'll see it's woven out of the finest possible silk. It was actually made on a Jacquard loom by weavers in Lyon. And to make this portrait required 24,000 cards, each with about 1,000 possible holes. And Babbage bought one of these very limited editions. He hung it on his wall because it was a way of demonstrating that machines can make beautiful things. On June the 5th, 1833, Ada Lovelace, age 17, was invited to one of Babbage's dinners, with a chaperone, no doubt. And this cartoon by Sidney Padua, graphics artist who's done some excellent work on Babbage. The cartoon here, you see Babbage being Babbage. This little bit here was particularly clever of me. Ada Lovelace looking on wide-eyed, and on the side, the two guests are saying, "Oh, look, we're present for the invention of the geek." Now, Ada Lovelace was an accomplished grounding in mathematics, and she knew the method of finite differences. She immediately recognized the operation of the machine, and she was the only guest, man or woman, who did. For a young woman of 17 entranced by the engine, a close collaboration and correspondence about the engine continued for her life. And here she is at age 17. And here is the prototype. Well, we call it a prototype. It was built by Babbage and Clement the year before the project was cancelled. Now, before the guests arrived, Babbage would set this machine up. And in this case, just as an illustration, I pretended it was set to count by twos. He put the engine on a side table, and after dinner, or maybe in the afternoon of one of his Sunday soirees, he'd gather the guests around and start cranking the handle and get the guests to call out 2, 4, 6, etc. Well, by the time he got to 20 or 30, he was having problems keeping the guests awake. But he jolly enough along, because when he got to 98, it would suddenly jump to 102. So there'd be a great explanation of, "Babbage is wrong, it's broken." "Well," said Babbage, "that's not so." He said he had set it up that way. And this is for his philosophy. Babbage thought that God started things up and maybe checked now and again. And he said, we make assumptions about God's laws as we only observe over a short time span. If we'd observed the prototype of the engine working for many, many times, we'd recognize that it skips when it gets to 100 every time. It's built into the design of the engine. It's not a miracle. Babbage thought that resurrections were not miracles, just something that happened once every 200,000 million deaths. This was very important because science was specializing at that point, and geologists were wondering about faults and earthquakes and volcanoes and species change in the fossil record. There was a great debate on whether these were miracles or whatever. And Babbage was saying, no, it's God's will. We just haven't been around long enough to figure out the rules. He was founder of the Statistical Society. And in 1842, Tennyson wrote, "Fill the cup and fill the can, have a roast before the morn. Every minute dies a man, every minute one is born." He felt compelled to write to Tennyson. I need hardly point out to you, but this calculation would tend to keep the sum total of the world's population in a state of perpetual equipoise. I would therefore take the liberty of suggesting that, in the next edition of your excellent poem, the erroneous calculation to which I refer should be corrected as follows. Every minute dies a man, and 1 6/10 are born. I may add that the exact figures are 1.167, but something must, of course, be conceded to the law of meter. It's thought that Babbage wrote this tongue-in-cheek, but he was a mathematician. He wasn't a people person. I think he meant it seriously. And Tennyson certainly took it seriously. In the 1900 edition of Tennyson's works, the editor, John Collins, said that all printings after 1851, the lines were amended. Every moment dies a man, every moment one is born. As a young man, Babbage set out on a remarkable journey of inventing things. His friend Brunel was trying to market the broad grade tracks for the Great Western Railway at 7 1/4 inch. The standard gauge in use elsewhere was 4 feet 8 1/2 inches. Brunel asked Babbage for help, and Babbage designed a chart recorder. This isn't the exact one Babbage designed, but it's similar. What happens is that a weight here is a float. It floats in a cistern of water. And as the water goes up and down, this pen here moves across the page. And this chart turns slowly. It's driven by clockwork. So the chart records the height of the water in the cistern. So Babbage took something like this and put it in a railway carriage. I think he probably used a sort of like a pendulum, a weight on an arm, to record the vibration and jerking around of the carriage. And he put it in a carriage and ran it down a piece of track at the broad gauge and reran it again in a carriage running on the narrow gauge, the standard gauge. Same speed, same track. And he could look at the recordings and compare them. And he could show definitively that the broad gauge gave a much more comfortable ride. But of course, politicians don't always take scientific advice. So the government decided on the standard gauge. And you can consider that next time you take a railway trip in the narrow gauge. Babbage went on to design a black box. It was a recorder that could be fitted into a train and record an incorruptible witness of the immediate antecedents of any catastrophe. He also invented a fail-safe quick-release coupling for railway carriages. It was abandoned because I think it's actually more dangerous. I think it's better to keep the carriages together, and that way they don't roll down embankments and stuff in the case of a derailment. And so the modern railways use couplings that can swivel in all sorts of directions but don't come undone. Babbage invented this device, a cowcatcher, for clearing debris off the track. He had solved Binier's auto-key cipher during the Crimean War, and the British intelligence corps didn't want the Russians to know the cipher had been broken, so he kept it quiet. And eventually, a junior officer got credit. Babbage withdrew from code breaking in 1857. He considered it as one of the most fascinating of arts, but he had become exasperated at repeated challenges, observing that few ciphers are worth the trouble of unraveling them. He said any intelligent schoolboy could make a cipher that would cost hours and even days for its solution. He invented the ophthalmoscope for internal eye examinations, but he didn't patent it, so Hermann Helmholtz got the patent 4 years later. In the 1800s, public nuisances were drunks or rowdy teenagers. Babbage was heavily involved in a public campaign against these figures. In 1857, he published a paper titled Table of the Relative Frequencies of the Causes of Breakage of Plate Glass Windows, which outlined just what percentages of broken windows were caused by these nuisances. He was contracted by the post office in England to look at the cost of mailing. At that time, the cost of postage depended how far you were sending the letters. Babbage figured out that the distance traveled really didn't make much difference. The cost was in the sorting and delivering of the mail, and so we should charge the same amount throughout the whole country. However, he was very annoyed by this and railed at the post office for providing only 4 deliveries a day for mail in London. So he went off and designed his own postal system. What he did was design this mechanism of wires, cables, that came out from a high point and swung out across supports and went across the country to other tall buildings. These wires are actually double wires with a steam engine at the top, and the wire is a long loop that goes around a pulley at the top, a bit like a clothesline, which is on a pulley at each end. You hang your clothes on the line and push the line out to push the clothes out over the garden or the parking lot or whatever. The idea here was that you put a letter rolled up inside a little carriage here that was hanging on a wire. And at the front of the carriage was a place where you could dial in, I suppose we call it the postal code today, where the letter was going. And so at intermediate way stations, such as this other church over here, the operator would look at the code and put it in the appropriate wire on the output side, and eventually the letter would get delivered. But if the wire was too busy or a particular cable was jammed, then they could send it down another wire going in the general direction. Of course, we do this today. It's called the internet. And the little dialing in at the front here is simply the IP address. Babbage had invented this diving bell, and you get inside it, get lowered down. He tested it from a boat in Plymouth Harbor. And being Babbage, of course, he took down equipment to measure his oxygen intake. He tested balancing, payloads, and ways of propulsion. He designed a pen with a rotating disc for drawing broken lines on maps. He invented theater lighting using colored filters. It was supposed to have fire risk because of the way the bright light was generated from a flame. He invented a tugboat for winching vessels upstream, a submarine propelled by compressed air, an altimeter, and a seismograph for recording earthquakes. A flat-bottomed boat that would aquaplane a hydrofoil. an astronomical micrometer, a coronagraph for producing artificial eclipses, a lifebuoy with a self-igniting mechanism triggered by the bobbing motion of the sea. I'm not certain about self-igniting unless they were setting off flares. I suspect it's a self-inflating. An arcade game, occulted lights for signaling system for communicating with ships at sea with pre-programmed messages coded into disks. He hated music. He hated any loud sounds. And he spent a considerable amount of time, one estimate 22% of his time, chasing street musicians away from his house on Dorset Street. Now, in fairness, at the post-mortem, he was found to have a problem with his ears, and so loud noises would have produced physical pain. Of musical instruments, he thought the absolute worst was the barrel organ. And that was, of course, what gave Ada Lovelace the incentive to invent steam music. Now, Ada was the daughter of Annabella Byron, née Isabella Milbank, and her husband had nicknamed her the Princess of Pallograms. She developed into a stiff religious woman with strict morals. She was also a member of the Blue Stocking Society. They were a group of intellectual women, shown here in a portrait. This was made a few years before Annabella became a member. But these women met at members' houses in the afternoon for tea, read the latest poetry or parts of books that were published, and discussed literature and other artistic things. They were called the Blue Stocking Society. And their hero, the pop star of the day, was Byron, mad, bad, and dangerous, George Gordon Byron, the sixth Baron Byron. Annabella fell for him in a big way. And indeed, she got him to marry her. And this charcoal sketch, supposedly on their marriage day, they don't look particularly happy, him particularly. But anyway, they got married January the 2nd, 1815. And Ada was born on December 10th of the same year. She had a dreadful marriage. Byron was an appalling person. Shortly after she gave birth, Byron attempted to rape his wife 4 times. The servants had to lock the door to keep us safe. Drunken abuse, attempted to evict his wife. Rumors of Byron's incestuous relationship with half-sister Augusta. Scandal, reported one correspondent in the Times, used more newspaper ink than the French War. She escaped with Ada and severed all contact with Byron. Byron soon after had to leave England to escape his creditors, and he wrote, "And when thou wouldst solace gather, when our child's first accents flow, wilt thou teach her to say, Father, there is care she must forego." And later, after leaving England and on the boat, and a storm was coming up, "Is thy face like thy mother's, my fair child, Ada, sole daughter of my house and heart? When last I saw thy young blue eyes, they smiled, and then we parted, not as we part now, but with a hope." Awakening, I'm going to restart that. "Is thy face like thy mother's, my fair child, Ada, sole daughter of my house and heart? When last I saw thy young blue eyes, they smiled, and then we parted, not as now we part, but with a hope. Awakening with a start, the waters heave around me, and on high the winds lift up their voices. I depart, whither I know not, but the hours gone by, when Albion's lessening shores could grieve or glad mine eye." A few years later, he died in Greece. He was a great hero there, and the Greeks wanted something of him, so they kept his heart. The rest of his body was embalmed in brandy, and it was sent back to England. Westminster Abbey wouldn't take it because of his questionable morals, and he finished up being married in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. Ada didn't have a very good childhood. Her mother told her nurse, "We must be careful to always speak the truth to her. Take care not to tell her any nonsensical stories that will be put fancies into her head. In fact, if she did anything fanciful, like write a poem or paint a picture, it was immediately burned." And she was fidgeted a lot. And at the age of 5, she was bound to a reclining board for lessons. And any movement, even the twitching of a finger, she was put in black bags and locked in a closet. And, as Sidney Padua, who did the cartoon, wrote, and trained from her earliest years to control the chaotic forces lurking within her hereditary. Her mother feared that growing up with her father's erratic and unpredictable temperament. To combat this, Ada was forced to learn science, mathematics, and logic. Now, she was a natural mathematician, so this was a wonderful, wonderful coincidence. Here she is, aged 7. James Gleek in The Information wrote, "She was a prodigy, clever at mathematics, encouraged by tutors, talented in drawing and music, fantastically inventive and profoundly lonely. When she was 12, she set about inventing a means of flying. I'm going to begin my paper wings tomorrow," she wrote her mother. She hoped to bring the art of flying to very great perfection. "I'm thinking of writing a book of flyology, illustrated with plates." For a while, she signed her letters with very affectionate carrier pigeon. She asked her mother to find a book illustrating bird anatomy because she was reluctant to dissect even a bird. She was tutored at home, and her first tutor, William Friend, was a clergyman, a radical reformer who left the Church of England, and he was expelled from his post in the town of Cambridge. He thought that zero didn't exist. It was therefore being most clearly proved that as all matter may be divided into parts infinitely smaller than the infinitely smallest part of the infinitesimal of nothing, so nothing has all the properties of something. He also wrote that mathematics was beyond the strength of a woman's physical power of application. Fortunately, his eldest daughter, Sophia, married Augustus de Morgan, who in 1828 began tutoring Ada, a much better fit. She didn't initially like Ada, who was also tutored by William King and Arabella Lawrence. In 1833, Ada visited Charles Babbage and saw his difference engine. Sophia reported that she had understood the principles of the machine. Caroline Herschel, a sister of the astronomer William, and aunt to Babbage's friend from university, John Herschel, she became the first woman to receive a salary for services to science. In 1835, she and Mary Somerville were elected as the first female honorary members of the Royal Astronomical Society. One might ask why they were honorary. William's son, John, became the best friend of Charles Babbage as students at Cambridge. Mary Somerville was a Scottish scientist, writer, and polymath. She studied mathematics and astronomy. Mary wrote the first English translation of the methods of calculus developed by Laplace, not as a straight translation from French, but including rederivations that were often credited as laying out some of the techniques and proofs for clarity. At that time, In early Victorian days, a woman couldn't write a scientific book, far too serious and difficult for her, but she could write a translation. And Mary Somerville was pushing the envelope a bit here by putting all her technical scientific thoughts into the footnotes. Ada had a strong respect and affection for Somerville, and they became close friends and corresponded for many years. And it was Mary who introduced her to Charles Babbage. Mary wrote, in all my time we lived at Chelsea. She lived quite close to Ada Lovelace. All the time we lived in Chelsea, we had constant intercourse with Lady Noel Byron and Ada. I kept up a correspondence with both as long as they lived. Ada was a pianist, singer, dedicated harpist, and her letters show that she put music on a par with maths. In 1837, she told Somerville, I played 4 or 5 hours generally, and never less than 3. And now, Luigi Menabrea comes back into our story. He had gone back to Italy, and he gave a lecture on Babbage's analytical engine. The lecture was given in Turin in French. Ada's translation of the Menabrea paper appeared in 1842. She'd taken a page out of Mary Somerville's book, and in addition to the translation, her footnotes were about 3 times as long as the translation. Menabrea had started his paper talking about the method of finite differences, and he used an example, the one I used in the first week, when I used x squared, calculated the differences at the first difference and second difference. Ada's notes under this said exactly the same thing, but in mathematical terms. She had further footnotes that indicate she clearly understood the mathematics of Menabrea's paper. What's become the most famous part of what Ada wrote is the computation of Bernoulli numbers. In note G, this seems to have come out of a letter she wrote to Babbage in July 43. She begins the letter with, I'm working very hard for you, like the devil in fact, which perhaps I am. Then she asks for some specific references and finally ends with, I want to put in something about Bernoulli numbers in one of my notes as an example of how an implicit function may be worked out by the engine without having been worked out by human head and hands first. Give me the necessary data and formula. Well, Babbage did, and Ada promptly wrote back, but he'd made a grave error. He'd made a mistake. And Babbage, please check my work below, which presumably he did. Now, the Bernoulli's numbers were published posthumously, and it's a practical solution to these problems with the squares and cubes. And they're very important because the difference engine would only run on polynomials, and some mathematical equations for which one might want to get tables aren't polynomials. And Bernoulli's formula, how shall we say, they push those equations, rework them to become polynomials and thus subject to solution by the difference engine. And she writes in her notes, we will terminate these notes by following up in detail the steps through which the engine could compute the numbers of Bernoulli, this being, in the form in which we shall deduce it, are rather complicated examples of its powers. This was a fairly leading-edge mathematics at the time. And here we see the equation. And here we see the program that Ada Lovelace wrote. Doran Swade writes, I confirmed that the manuscript evidence clearly shows that Babbage wrote programs for his analytical engine in in 1836 to 1837, i.e., 6 to 7 years before the publication of Ada's article in 1843. There are about 24 such programs, and they have the identical features of the Lovelace's famous program at Suede. The historian says that the new tests are unarguable and that they do not support, indeed they contradict, the claim that Ada Lovelace was the first programmer. Later in the 1970s, Thomas Meiser at the Minnesota University just transcribed Ada's program into Fortran. In doing so, he detected a few misprints and only one significant error, with one variable having the wrong sign. Personally, I take exceptions to this. He got the sign wrong. It could have been a typo. It could have just been a slip. It's the sort of thing that happens to humans all the time. Anyway, he got it fixed. He ran the program, and there was a problem. It wasn't in Ada's program, but in the textbook he used to check the results. Now, fortunately, it wasn't a significant error. It was down in the sort of 5th or 6th decimal place. But still, it does prove that the Ada's program would work. Babbage was the father of the computer. It was Ada who really is the mother of the modern computer. Babbage only saw his machine as a sophisticated mathematical calculator. Ada, on the other hand, had a remarkable burst of genius. She called her insights into science poetical science, and certainly she brought a poetical imagination to her analysis and thought about Babbage's work, even to the point of composing music. Doran Suede wrote, "Put an end to the discussion of Lovelace's contribution. Her notes and letters to Babbage makes it clear that Ada understood the potential of computers in a way that he never did, and that nobody ever had. As science and music have long been entwined, such as canons and fugues, where the music repeats patterns which are transposed, inverted, and reversed." Ada wrote, "I shall in due time become a poet." After all, she had accesses to Byron's writings. They were in her mother's library. And I'm sure she'd have agreed with Einstein, who, years later, wrote that pure mathematics is the poetry of logical ideas. In Ada's notes G, she said, "The analytical engine has no pretensions whatsoever to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to do and how we order it to perform. Its province is to assist us in making available what we're already acquainted with." Menabrea agrees that the machine is not thinking. However, Alan Turing addressed Lady Lovelace's objection by saying, "Who can be certain that the original work that he has done is not simply the growth of the seed planted in him by teaching or the effect of well-known principles?" Next week, we'll talk about the analytical engine itself and see how it works.